For those of you who were with us last night, you heard about the impact of Pulitzer Prize winning journalism on civil rights and social justice over this past century. This afternoon, we're going to explore today's coverage of social justice and equality and where it should go in the future to serve readers, viewers, listeners, and ultimately our self-governed democracy. This is an incredibly timely discussion. In recent months, several of our nation's communities have wrestled with serious questions of unequal justice and inequality. We've seen it in Ferguson, in New York, in Chicago, in Baltimore, in Charleston, and elsewhere. We have an incredibly distinguished panel of 4 Pulitzer Prize winners here to discuss these issues this afternoon. And moderating it all is a distinguished and familiar face and voice. Eric Deggans is the TV critic for NPR. Before joining NPR in 2013, he was at the Tampa Bay Times for 20 years, many of them as the paper's TV and media critic. He's won numerous national awards, and he's a frequent guest on national TV news programs. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Salon, CNN, and elsewhere. He's also an author, and like me, perhaps most importantly, he's a proud graduate of Indiana University. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Eric Deggans.
Yeah, he had to get that one in. Go Hoosiers. So after September and the Singers performed, I looked over at Tim and I'm like, you gonna make me follow that? But so thank you, Roy, for putting the poets between us and the Singers. So we have a chance of making an impact here. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and as I introduce you, I want you guys to come up. And I tried to do some research, but if I get it wrong, just correct me, because we want to be accurate. This is Pulitzer's, after all, right? So first, Mr. Leonard Pitts, 2004 winner. Why don't you come up? A nationally syndicated columnist, commentator, journalist, and novelist. I started reading Leonard's work when he was a pop music writer. And thought, man, I want to do that. And then he moved on to talk about everything, race, politics, culture. He's written 5 books, including 3 novels. So, Mr. Leonard Pitts. Next, we have Eugene Robinson. Gene. 2009 winner. Writes a twice-a-week column on politics and culture syndicated by the Washington Post Writers Group. Appears often on MSNBC and Meet the Press as a rare voice of reason. Yeah. Knocking some sense in the morning, Joe. And he's written 3 books. Had a 3-decade-plus career at the Washington Post with jobs ranging from City Hall reporter to assistant managing editor. Next, Cynthia Tucker Haynes. 2007 winner, writes a weekly syndicated column. She's a veteran journalist who was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and served as editorial page editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's also a visiting professor of journalism and Charlene Hunter-Gault Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Georgia. After this is over, you're going to have to tell me how you got Charlene to get you that gig, because I want to do that too. And next, Stephen Henderson. 2014 winner, editorial page editor for the Detroit Free Press and host of a daily radio show, a weekly TV talk show, works as a reporter for the ABC affiliate and WXYZ. This brother likes to work. He's also received a Journalist of the Year award from the National Association of Black Journalists. A hand for our august panel, all Pulitzer winners. So in this week's edition of Black Folks Talk to You About Civil Rights, you talk to some folks, and there's a sense that we're in the middle of a new civil rights movement. Particularly folks look at the Black Lives Matter movement and come to that conclusion. I wonder, do you guys agree? And if so, what challenges does this new movement hold for the journalists that are trying to cover and commentate about it? Leonard, why don't you start? Hello? Because your mic's not on. That's why you don't start. Does anyone's mics work?
Hello?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there you. Can you hear me?
Is this thing on?
It's on.
Yeah, it's
on. It just must not be out. How about now?
Yeah, turn them up a little bit if you can.
What was the question? No. You know, you say, are we in the middle of a new civil rights movement? We're in the middle of something. I'm not sure if it's a civil rights movement or not. I just know that 10 years ago when I would speak on college campuses, I would talk to a lot of young people who would say that they are upset about the state of things. What can we do to change it? And I would chastise them for their apathy and remind them that their parents were able to change the world with rotary dial telephones and mimeograph machines. You know, what are you with your iPads and iPods, whatever, doing, asking what can you do to change the world? So I'm seeing a lot of energy, you know, and this is not just the Black Lives Matter movement, this is Occupy, you know, and several other things. I'm seeing a lot of energy. What I'm not yet seeing is a lot of focus. But I'm not just, you know, the civil rights movement did, you know, when Martin Luther King's forces did, you know, march in Kelly Ingram Park, or when John Lewis led the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they weren't just marching to be marching, and they weren't just marching to draw attention. They were marching toward a specific goal. We want a Civil Rights Act. We want a Voting Rights Act, and that's the part that I'm seeing that's missing from what's going on now. But I have great hope that we are going to see that component. In terms of the challenges for us as journalists, I think the challenges are not so much presented by a given movement as by the fact that, you know, as a news industry, we have shied away. We have chosen every excuse we can not to cover these issues. You know, in the years since the Civil Rights Movement, we have taken every route we can to avoid and to escape this stuff, and as a result, and in the process of our silence, things have just gotten. I can't even say worse. Things have gotten insane. Things have become bizarre.
Wow.
We're living in bizarro America right now. And I think part of that is due to the fact of our allowing people to get away with a false narrative. And, you know, I'll put it to you like this. You know, when I say that we don't cover race, people tend to look at me strangely and say, well, what about Ferguson? What about Shirley Sherrod? What about this, that, and the other? We cover the circus that arises from race. When race becomes unavoidable, then we go and do our due diligence, and we parachute into Ferguson, or we parachute into Baltimore and do the stories. We parachute into Flint and do the stories. Where are we before that? Where are we in terms of providing the context so that people can understand these things? I think it was Pew, if I may mention that name in Poynter's party, that did a study which I found very interesting that showed that stories about race, media tend to drop much more quickly than other stories. Like within the next week after Shirley Sherrod, you know, the news hole was down, and I forget the exact number, but it was down some substantial amount as compared to, say, any other subject. So we're slow to get there, and we drop it as soon as we possibly can. And I think that, you know, until and unless we address that and really sort of, you know, deal with why we are so reluctant, we're not going to be playing our full role in terms of, you know, addressing these issues.
But Eugene, I want to ask you about this because you've been a news manager. You ran the style section.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Well, mostly. I mean, I think there is, to your original question, I think there is a civil rights movement going on now, and Black Lives Matter is part of it, and there are lots of other parts of it. And the reason it's hard to discern the focus is that it's sort of distributed. It's pointillistic. It's networked, but it's not in one place. And so, because that's the way the world is these days, and that's the way social media works, and that's so. I think the challenge, or one challenge for us, aside from just, you know, cover the damn story, but one challenge is that is precisely that lack of an identifiable, you know, one focus, one set of leaders. I think it's just more difficult to get a handle on. So how do you do it? Well, you know, I think at our best when we cover issues of race, and by the way, I would also throw in issues of gender and LGBT, and you know, which are all sort of part of this, part of what I think is the movement that's going on now. It's best when it's day in and day out coverage, and you know, we, I think, flatter ourselves when we think that our, big, huge 90-inch per part series is going to have as much impact as we believe. I think there's more impact and you get better stories when you just assign somebody, make it a beat, and you make it part of your daily coverage, and also part of your the way you run your institution. But we can talk about that later.
Yeah. I've always been amazed. You turn on the local news and you see the stock market report every day. Why don't we see a story that relates to diversity every day? Cynthia, one of the things that strikes me about this too is that those of us who've written about race a lot can fall into the trap of talking about it the same way all the time. I'm wondering, when you go to write about these subjects, how do you find a new way of coming at it? And have you been particularly challenged by trying to cover this new form of civil rights activism that we're seeing?
Let me start with the first question. I have been in this business more years than I care to say. Many of you in this room know how long I've been doing it, and much of my career has been spent writing commentary. And I have mostly had free hand to choose the topics I want to write about. I often write about civil rights and social justice issues because they appeal to me for any number of obvious reasons. But there have also been periods, as recently as 2 weeks ago, when I thought, don't write about race again, because the newspapers that run your column, which are dwindling already, by the way, don't want to hear that again. And so I have this internal struggle over what I think is important and needs to be said, and what I think the market will bear, as it were. As it turns out, most of the time I end up writing about the race or social justice topic anyway, because the other column I tried to make myself write didn't turn out very well. Anybody who has spent any time in the writing dodge knows that you write best about that stuff that you care about most deeply. That's just the way it works. Yeah. I would argue, though, that we are challenged. We are no better at talking about, and perhaps we are worse now, about writing and talking about race now than we were 60 years ago. I remember living in D.C. At the beginning of the Obama administration, writing for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, when it was quite clear to me that the Tea Party assemblage was not new. There was nothing new about these people. I knew the same people 50 years ago. Not the same individuals, but I knew that movement. They were, John Birchers. They were the South will rise again types. I had seen them. I had seen their slogans. But when I tried to suggest this in columns, in TV commentary, no one wanted to talk about it. And so I think we remain challenged in talking about race. One correction, I am no longer at UGA. I loved my academic career, but I am now back in LA. And no, I don't mean Los Angeles, I mean Lower Alabama. I live in Mobile, Alabama, the heart of Trump territory, where we are particularly challenged in our inability to talk about race in the newspaper, on television, in a way that is intelligent, articulate, and makes sense.
I think Florida might contest with you on the heart of Trump territory banner, given what happened here. Stephen, you want to take a whack at this question?
Yeah, I think some of the things Cynthia's talking about are particularly relevant here. From my perspective as well, I would add that, I can't remember who it was who brought up the Flint water crisis, though, which is just up the road from us in Detroit. It's a couple hours up I-75. And one of the things that's been really frustrating about that story, from my perspective, is the focus on now and this, as opposed to how did we get here? How do you have a city that, you know, is sitting over its books and making a decision about saving money over clean drinking water, for instance? And there is a story there. There is a really important story that we're now trying to tell about 50 or 60 years of urban policy that has said cities don't matter and that suburbs matter more. Highway planning, sprawl, job loss, population loss, you know, and you can go back over many, many generations and many, many administrations, Democratic, Republican, whatever, that created the situation in Flint. Just in the last 10 years, for instance, Flint has lost 25% of its population, 33% of its state funding, and half of the businesses that exist in downtown. So what did you think was going to happen? But the coverage of that decline gets, it sort of gets suppressed because it's not something that, it's not an incident. It's something that happens over time, and we sort of take it for granted. And so I think some of it is about calling out race where it's not obvious, right? Those declines in our cities are about race on many levels, and we're reluctant sometimes to say that. Calling out race in the presidential election, calling out race in the Trump campaign, and showing how the things that he is saying echo things that Ronald Reagan said that relate to the Southern strategy. I got in a little bit of trouble on Meet the Press a couple of weeks ago. I think they couldn't get Eugene to be on, so they called me. And we were talking about Donald Trump, and Mary Madeline, who's, you know, a very well-respected Republican strategist, was talking about the campaign, Donald Trump's campaign, and everyone else was talking about it, and no one mentioned that the things he's saying are things that Republicans have been saying in quoted language for 30 or 40 years. So I said, well, you know.
You did it.
I said, you know, I have a problem believing Republicans when they say, well, he's not one of us, because someone like Ronald Reagan, for instance, goes to Neshoba County, Mississippi, and gives a speech about states' rights in 1980. And what is he saying if he's not saying race? And of course, Mary Madeline, her eyes started to bug out of her head, and she looked very uncomfortable. And I said that. I said, I know this makes you uncomfortable.
No, she looked pissed.
she looked
really, really pissed.
Let's be honest. Let's be honest. She was pissed. Because what did she say to you after that?
Well, she said she wanted to choke me.
Yep.
And the first thing that jumped in my mind was, you'd have to wait in a long line if you were going to do that. But again, I think calling out race in that context is important, because I'm quite sure that if I hadn't said that, the conversation at that table would never have turned to the racial undercurrent of that issue. And that's a huge problem, because I think the white reporter sitting at the table should have said, well, you know, race is an issue here too, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
I'd just like to make a quick observation here. It's interesting to me that all four of us, in different ways, have made essentially the same point, which is that we in news media do a terrible job of talking about race and/or just avoid the discussion whenever we can. And it strikes me, it reminds me of a conversation I had last night coming out of the theater with my boss, to the effect that those journalists that we saw on the screen, all of them had to have great physical courage to do what they did. They're risking life, limb, livelihood. You know, they're having their homes shot through, bullets shot into their homes. They're dealing with bombs and threats to their well-being. You know, the only courage that's required of us is moral courage. You know,
I don't know. Have you covered a Trump rally recently?
Trump,
That might change, man.
Trump rallies excluded. Good point.
We have a training course at NPR to help you
But-
figure out how to
but-
deal with that.
Trump aside, all that's been required of us is moral courage, and it says something that we can't muster even then. And this, speaking of Trump, and I'm probably going to write a column about this at some point, maybe in the next week or two. I'm so frustrated with so many of us in media, identifying the force that's pushing him as middle-class frustration. That is such a weak-kneed euphemism.
Yep.
What middle-class frustration with what? And please understand.
With who?
Yeah, with who? And why with who? I mean, it's very plain and clear, and it really bothers me that so many of us buy into this euphemistic, weak tea, as opposed to just, calling it what it is. So, there's courage is still required, only this time it's moral courage, and we seem to be coming up consistently short.
So what's interesting to me about this is that in one moment we have the Huffington Post putting at the end of every Trump article that he's a racist and a sexist and a misogynist. We have The Root, we have Black Voices, we have Slate, we have all of these media outlets that are writing about race. But at the same time, I look at the New York Times and they have a wine critic, but they don't have somebody whose job it is to cover race as a beat. So what's going on here? Why are we seeing this? On the one hand, we have all these media outlets that are talking about it, but on the other hand, many of our most august publications are dropping the ball.
Well, race is scary, and besides that, race is won. It's finished. Racism is over.
That's right. We got a black president. I forgot.
Exactly.
Yes.
You have a black president.
What else do you want?
What more do you people want?
What more do you want?
You get those emails too?
Oh, yes, all the dang time. Basically, Martin Luther King came and fixed everything, and then, after 1968, kumbaya, and we shall overcome, and how are you enjoying life in the promised land?
Right.
Okay, and that, I think,
forgot.
is, that is what a lot of us as Americans cling to. And I think, particularly you mentioned the august, news, news outlets. Here's the thing. I think that if you want to think of yourself as a good and decent person, then if you see injustice, if you see stuff going on, then you are required to do something or to say something or to stand up, or else you jeopardize your impression of yourself as a good and decent person. Well, doing something, saying something, standing up is uncomfortable. Therefore, I don't see it. Okay, that's pretty literally, I think, the mindset that's going on. There's so much rationalization, and the rationalization just reaches the point of utter absurdity and historical or historical lunacy sometimes. But these are the depths to which, or the lengths to which people go to avoid seeing what's right in front of their faces. I knew that, and I mentioned this to Ray Arsenault about an hour ago, I knew that we had gone down the rabbit hole, and some of you may have seen this when Van Jones is on CNN arguing with Jeffrey Lord, who claims the Ku Klux Klan was a leftist organization. And why do you say that? Why do you say this? Well, because I'm on the right, and the right has a dubious history in terms of these issues. I would prefer to think of myself as a good person.
Right.
Therefore, the Ku Klux Klan cannot have come from my political ideology, so therefore it has to be over there.
Yep. Anybody else want to take that?
I think that idea that it makes too many people uncomfortable to call out race is much more widespread than the Jeffrey Lords. You talked about Mary Madeline, again, years ago when I was in D.C., writing about the Affordable Care Act, going to rallies of Tea Partiers holding up the most racist, inflammatory signs. They were ostensibly there to protest the Affordable Care Act, but the signs told me something different. I knew that there was a sizable racist component to their resistance. The idea being that Obama, a black president, was creating a giveaway to undeserving black people.
Yep.
There was research on this. But I remember that Mary Madeline's husband, James Carville, a Democrat, conducted a focus group of working class whites, and he came back and said, several of them are opposed to the Affordable Care Act, but race has nothing to do with it. I said, how do you know that? He said, they said so. I was stunned by that. Carville is a sophisticated political operative. Really? Meanwhile, some researchers at a university had done research in which they had held a focus group, laid out the components of the Affordable Care Act, told one part of the focus group, this is Bill Clinton's plan. Do you support this? Most of them did. Told another part of the focus group, this is Barack Obama's plan. Do you support this? Most of them did not. Well, what is that? But again, I could not get Carville to acknowledge that. So I think that this business of calling out race and how uncomfortable it makes us is pretty widespread.
Right. Well, do you think part of the problem is we're in a media culture now where the audience almost controls us in a way, and it's hard to confront an attitude that the audience resists without worrying about losing news clicks, without worrying about losing ratings? I mean, is Morning Joe going to talk about race in the way that we want, without fear of turning off all the angry white guys who show up to watch that show? I mean,
well, look, we're also in an age where being provocative and making noise is a business model or a political strategy that gets you to be the Republican frontrunner. But so I would, if what you said is the assumption, I would push back and say, no, there is, I think, a commercial argument to be made for being provocative in a way that that raises issues that people perhaps are uncomfortable with, but are, you know.
But I think what we're saying is that being provocative about race turns people off. That's the fear. And that Donald Trump can go out there and say what he says because he knows there's a constituency out there who wants to hear him say that. They're tired of the code words. They want to hear it plainly.
Yeah.
But is there a constituency out there that wants to hear plain talk about race the way we're talking about it?
I hope so, because
and if so, and if there is, why aren't we doing it?
That constituency has to, because you know, let's find out. I mean, you know, you put it out there, and you know, when I write about race, I get a lot of that's a topic on which I get a lot of comments, a lot of you know, Twitter, either you know, favorable tweets or you know, he's a communist tweets. But I hear from a lot of people, and people now, I was going to say people engage. Actually, a lot of them don't engage. A lot of them just react. Right. And there is a difference. But that's a start. Yeah, you know, sure. I mean, you get, and I find that it gets people's attention.
Yeah, if the argument is just, you know, I would co-sign that, because if the argument is just what's going to, you know, get people to read or to engage, I write about a lot of things, but if I assert that, you know, racism still exists, or if I assert that Muslims are human beings, or if I assert that gay people are human beings, those are like the subjects that are going to get the most response. The response to those types of things, human rights things essentially, are always volcanic, overwhelming, much more than most other topics.
And I find, by the way, that writing like Muslims are human beings, as opposed to writing, you know, black people are human beings, you almost get more sort of angry reactions when you write about Muslims, which is interesting these days.
So Stephen, you're an editorial page editor. And again, I'm trying to understand this. So we say that columns about race get a lot of response, People pay attention to them. They're at the heart of these stories like the Flint water crisis and, institutional racism and policing. I mean, some of the biggest stories of our time. So why aren't we covering race regularly?
Well, I mean, I think we are in some ways. I mean, no one's assigned to it, but, it comes up so much that you can't help but be writing about it. I mean, I get lots of, part of the irony is also just the feedback you get from both sides, right? I get nasty letters and postcards. That's my favorite thing. People send these little postcards where they like scribble in marker or crayon on them and mail them to me. No return address, of course, but and they'll say, all you want to talk about is race. You're a race baiter. You're this, you're that. You only have your job because of affirmative action anyway. Why don't they fire you? But then I also get a lot of complaints from African Americans, and this may be because we're in Detroit, which is still the largest majority black city in the country. I get a lot of people who say, you guys don't write enough about race. You don't call it out enough. You've got that job, you got that voice. Why don't you use it more? To talk about race, and that can sometimes sort of make you think about what you're writing as well. Am I calling it out as consistently as possible? I'm not sure that I agree anymore. I mean, we used to have diversity writers. When I was a young reporter in the newsroom, there used to be diversity writers, people whose job was to cover diversity or race or things like that. And I always felt like that was a sort of ghettoization of the issue a little bit. I'm not sure that that's a bad idea in and of itself, but in isolation, I think it's a problem. What we need are reporters who can see the racial component or the racial dimension in issues that otherwise don't necessarily seem like they are about race. And we need white, and other people of other backgrounds to be able to see that too. It can't just be on the few African Americans you have in your newsroom. I'll give you a good example of that, and this is not in the newsroom. But last week, I think it was, the governor of Michigan got a report about the Flint water crisis from a panel that he had appointed. And we expected that this would be, it would be accurate, but they would pull punches a little bit. They didn't. They clobbered him. I mean, the people he chose to look into this issue saw the same thing that everybody else saw, that this was just gross negligence on a massive scale. And at the press conference, a reporter asked the governor whether he believed Flint was about race. Was the fact that this was a majority black city the part of the reason that the response was so slow and that his attitude has been so bad? And he said point blank, no. I mean, he's been really annoyed by that question lately, and he gets this look on his face. He gets this look where he purses his lips and clenches his jaw, and he gives you the hard blink away, like, I'm just not even looking at you anymore. And one of the people he appointed to this task force stopped him, a white former Senate Majority Leader, and said, no, Governor, that's wrong. This is about race, and here's how it's about race, and went into this really long explanation of environmental justice and how that works and how it's not about your intentions, it's about the effect and the systems that contribute to these kind of things. And I thought that was such a great moment, not necessarily for journalism, because this was not a journalist, but it was a powerful recognition on the part of this former politician that race plays out in ways that we don't think it does. And I think we need more of that in newsrooms. And I'm not sure that is about a race beat or a diversity beat so much as it is about how we train reporters to think about these things.
And if I may, Eric, one of the places, there are lots and lots of subjects, and I agree with Stephen completely. What we need as reporters who are sophisticated enough and well-trained enough that they see the racial component that surfaces in many, many issues. And one of the topics that I have started to write about a lot more because I think race is certainly a component of that, and clearly poverty is a component as well. Public education. We used to have education reporters. Back in the day, every major newspaper had more than one education reporter. I can think, and for my money, it's one of the budding civil rights issues of our time. There is certainly a poverty component, huge poverty component, and we all know that race and poverty in this country still intersect. And it has more, and it's not just black children, it is children of color. We have a growing Latino population in this country, and they are often stuck in failing schools as well. Where we have education reporters left, we don't have many of them. I'm not sure how, now in Detroit, because Detroit is so often an exaggerated example of everything, people have started to talk more openly with the public school teachers having walkouts to talk about the horrible state of the facilities. There has been some conversation in Detroit around race in public schools. But that's just one subject where I think we need reporters who are trained in a subject matter, but can see the racial component where there is one in that subject.
So,
I guess one question I would have, though, is, just as you were talking about education, I was just thinking about examples of when news organizations did a great job of writing about race and public education, and right here where we are. I mean, the Tampa Bay Times and some stories that were done about the state of the schools in South St. Petersburg, and in my recollection, the stories pulled no punches whatsoever about going straight to the racial component of those yawning disparities. But in the end, what happens? I mean, and maybe I think this way because of all the people who write me on other topics on politics. Why don't you call Donald Trump out for this? Well, I did, actually. Why don't you call him out for that? And people get upset that the public has not reacted in the way they believe the public should react, rather than that, recognizing that in fact the work was done and the facts are out there, and so I think I'm not arguing that our news organizations do a great job of covering race by any stretch of the imagination, but actually we do it, and sometimes do it well.
yeah, and because you referenced the education series, we have seen some local reaction. I mean, people have reacted a lot to the series, and I think we're going to see some efforts to change the schools because of it. So there can be change due to great journalism. I want to broaden this a little bit because diversity can come in a lot of different forms, and we're also seeing a push for gay rights. And we're also, you talked about how we talk about Muslims and what's happened there. So in particular, I want to talk about gay rights and how we cover the push for gay rights at a time when these battles are right down to the local level now. They're right down to these ordinances about whether or not you can go into a bathroom or whatever. We're trying to educate people about these issues, and how is the gay rights struggle sort of similar to and different than the classic civil rights struggle that we've gotten used to covering?
Well, the differences are obvious. Nobody was kidnapped from, gay land and brought here to, work and do, work in fields. But I think I think
Are you sure about that? Did you research that?
I'm pretty sure.
Was that fact checked?
I'm pretty sure, but I think it is entirely possible to make too much of the differences. Because to me, as a writer, I'm more fascinated by the intersections. It's interesting to me that the Bible is used to demonize and ostracize gay people in precisely the same way it was used to demonize and ostracize African American people not so long ago. So I'm more fascinated by the intersections. The other thing that I'll tell you is that I used to have a reader who could not understand why I wrote so much about gay rights. And he used to try to taunt me. He'd send me emails like, "Dear Mrs. Pitts," because in his formulation, in order for me to be concerned about gay rights, I had to be gay or have some sort of sexual identity crisis or whatever. But the thing is, and it's a weird alchemy, but the thing is that what I've discovered and what I've seen the historical pattern of is that when you express concern about somebody else's struggle for human dignity or whatever, it has a validity to it that they cannot bring. As an African American, there's certain things that I can bring to talking about the African American struggle. There's things that if you're white, you don't know or haven't experienced. But if a white guy says Donald Trump is a racist, it carries a different weight, a stronger weight than just me saying. And that's bizarre, because again, I'm the one with the firsthand experience, but it's true. If I say something about women's issues or women's rights or stand up for equal pay for women, it has a different weight. It's stronger in many ways than if a woman says it, even though I don't have that experience. So for me as an African American, I feel an obligation not just to stand up for African American rights, but to stand up for the rights of all these other folks, because I know that there is a different weight. The same as, last night we celebrated all these, white editors who, had the courage to stand up for African American freedom. It would not, they carried a different authority, and they carried a different, again, weight. I keep coming back to that term, a different weight than African Americans did, who were writing at the same time and saying essentially the same things from a position of firsthand perspective.
Eugene, you look like you wanted to say. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just thinking that's a very good point.
So,
I think it is.
any other thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about the gay rights movement for me has been how quickly things have changed for that community. I was the Supreme Court reporter for Knight Ridder in 2003 when the Lawrence v. Texas case was in front of the court, and that was the case about gay sodomy, where Texas went in, busted into somebody's apartment, and arrested them for engaging in gay sex. And the court overturned the law, going back on a decision that had just been made 15 years before in 1987. And at that time, Justice Scalia, who just died, wrote a really, really passionate and awful, in my opinion, dissent from that case that talked about how that was what would open the floodgates. And he sort of had this unbelievable parade of horribles, things were going to happen as a result of the court doing that. And lots of people at the time said, oh no, even if you disagreed with him, you said that's not going to happen, it won't happen that quickly, et cetera, et cetera. But boy, I mean, if you go back and look at the things he said were going to happen, they all almost have come true. Most states now recognize gay rights to adoption in more form than they did then. Last year, I still think that the biggest story last year was the marriage equality ruling out of the Supreme Court. I think 30, 40 years from now, that will be how 2015 is defined in the history books. And that is a really, really quick change. Justice Scalia's dissent in 2003 essentially said that gay people had no right to even be petitioning the courts for these things, because essentially they were people, he said, whose society had attached a certain amount of scorn to, of cultural scorn, and that if they wanted their rights, they needed to petition their fellow citizens for it. And it was very redolent of the Dred Scott decision by the court that said African Americans could not be made people by Congress because they weren't. And so in 12 or 13 years to go from that kind of a dissent on the court to full marriage equality, which I'm pretty sure that's what we achieved last year. I think there's going to be some fighting over it, is really, really remarkable. And I don't think, I mean, I wasn't alive for most of the civil rights movement. I don't think things changed quite that quickly, where you had just these dramatic reversals.
Actually, I think they
Did it
Yeah, well, I
also?
mean,
You guys are older. You might know.
Ouch! Really?
well, excuse me.
Well, thank you for pointing that out,
Let
Mr.
me
Young.
look from my liver spots, but
Really?
Apparently, ageism is still
Yeah.
acceptable
Really?
up here.
Really?
Okay.
the thing that we tend to forget is that what's commonly called the civil rights movement was 13 years long. And to go from where we were in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to where we were by the time Dr. King stepped out on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel was actually very fast by by the tides of history.
There is, I agree with what my fellow columnist said about the gay rights movement and writing about it. One of the privileges I've had, as I said earlier, is always being able to choose the topics I wanted to write about. And I think one of the responsibilities for me personally that has come with that is sometimes to offend what I think of as my core constituency, and that is my black readers, if I thought they needed to be brought along. So in Atlanta, where we had a sizable gay population, I spent a lot of time writing about gay rights and offended a lot of good black churchgoers along the way. I thought that was part of my job because I did remind them, they use the Bible against us too. These days, I not only write about gay rights. Stephen said there may still be some resistance. As I said, now in LA, we still resisting. There are still probate judges who don't want to give marriage licenses, et cetera, et cetera. So I have done some writing about that. But I find I probably get more resistance these days when I write about Muslim Americans.
Yeah,
I'm again in the
exactly.
heart of the Bible Belt, and every now and then I have some good black churchgoer come up to me and say, for example, I wrote a column not long ago saying about prayer in public places. That, if it's okay with you, if an imam stands up and gives a prayer in your child's kindergarten class, then we're okay. But if that's not okay with you, then we don't need a Baptist preacher giving this prayer either. And I had a couple of little old ladies, good church ladies, come up to me and say, you really don't mean that. To which I said, yes, ma'am, I do. That's what pluralism is all about. And so for me, again, the particular responsibility has been to push back against those who I think of as in my core constituency, who need to be, in my view, brought along a bit.
So I got the high sign, but I want to ask one more question before we wrap this up, and thank you very much, guys, for doing this. We've already talked a little bit about this idea that a lot of what we're seeing, particularly in the Trump phenomenon, is a reaction to a black president. And so I wonder, as we sort of come to the close of his second term, when it comes to the racial climate in America, how do you think President Obama is going to be remembered? And what do you think about how journalists have covered him regarding him and race and what we're seeing today?
Well, it depends on who does the remembering, right? I mean, and,
Keep in mind, I got
who
the high
writes
sign.
history?
Keep in mind, I got the high sign, so I'd like each of you to respond
it kind of does.
pretend you're on Morning Joe.
Well, and it also depends what comes after him. If the answer is Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, Obama's going to be remembered as FDR, But I mean, I'm serious. I mean, it's all relative, and look, his popularity is up to what's up 53 now or something like that. It's and rising. as the campaign goes on. So, like a lot of presidents, he'll become much more popular after he leaves office. And I do think his place in, I think his place in history, both domestically and on race and internationally, hasn't quite yet been written, because we'll have to see how some things work out.
I am always amused when my readers tell me that Barack Obama has made race relations the worst in this country, and he's divided us instead of bringing us back together. What's amusing about it is that anybody who's followed the president with any kind of fair observation knows that Barack Obama speaks about race very reluctantly and very rarely. But Barack Obama talks about race only slightly more often than Mitch McConnell says, "Get down with your bad self." Okay? So the only thing, essentially the only thing Obama...
Again, I have to ask if you fact-check that.
I'm pretty sure I'm on solid ground. Essentially, the only thing that Obama has done with regard to race is exist and be presidenting while black. Okay, so if you ask me what the memory is going to be, what the legacy is going to be with regard to race specifically, I think it's going to be that he forced this country. He brought out a lot of stuff that this country had convinced itself, and in some corners still convinces itself, is done, is gone, we have overcome, kumbaya, how are you enjoying the promised land? He's forced this country to face itself, to see itself. And again, he's done that by nothing he's done, nothing he said, just by, presuming that the fact that I was elected twice means I'm the president of the United States.
I got to throw in one other quick thing. I know you got the hindsight, but I got to say, I do think one other lasting impact of the Obama presidency in terms of race is visual, and it's the image of him and the family walking across the South Lawn to get on Marine One to fly away to Camp David or wherever they're going. That we saw that image for decades. Everybody, you can see it now, but for the first time, we see it with the black family. I think that scrambles the brains of people in this country. It expands the range of the possible, and it has an impact that I think is more subliminal than anything else. But I think it's huge.
I was just going to say, I love that phrase, presidenting while black. I'm going to use that. Go ahead.
Copyright, sorry.
Fair use, buddy.
As Gene just mentioned, I think the impact of the image, the visceral impact especially on people who are in high school and younger, is more than we can imagine. In my dotage, I happen to have a 7-year-old, a first grader. Her only notion of a president is of a black man.
Yep.
Every time I think about that, I almost tear up.
Stephen?
Yeah, I have a 10 and 12-year-old, and it's the same for them. And I've written a couple times about how one of the great measures of this country is progress over time, and it's sometimes hard to see it. But my father, their grandfather, was born in 1933 in Mississippi and is unable to vote in his home state until he's in his mid-30s. And his grandson doesn't know anything different than a black president. I mean, that really is American exceptionalism. In terms of the president, I mean, I think you can't. You have to start with productivity. Look at how much this guy got done, and really in just 2 years. Because once he lost the House, there was not much else to do. And in the modern presidency, especially, that's very difficult because the government's so divided. It's really hard to get stuff done. So just getting the Affordable Care Act done, the TARP and the auto bailouts, and I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is going to set him apart. And then again, the racial thing. I mean, first black president. He's not going to have any competition for that in history. So I mean, this is someone who will be on money someday when we're all gone.
Yeah.
But it will take that time and the hindsight to be able to see it.
Well, according to Ben Carson, we still haven't had a black president. But anyway, thank you very much, guys. We really appreciate your time with us. So it's my turn to bring to the stage someone who used to be my boss, the head honcho here, the chairman and CEO of the Tampa Bay Times and Times Publishing Company, and as well as a member of the Pulitzer Board, Mr. Paul Tash.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Wasn't that a great exchange here? I had the great privilege of serving on the Pulitzer Prize board for 9 years, and every April when I left that meeting at Columbia University, I was struck by two very powerful reactions. One was, wow, there is still a lot of great work and how difficult it is to win a Pulitzer Prize. You see the quality of the work here represented before you today in these four terrific individuals, and that's repeated over and over in the finalists that get to the board and those very hard choices that we face. The second reaction I would always have is it's amazing what we know as citizens, as communities, as a country, only because of journalism, and in the case of Pulitzer's, necessarily newspaper journalism. It's stunning to think about the absence it would leave without the contribution to civic knowledge and public debate, without the kind of work that is represented in that very finest tradition upheld and advanced by the Pulitzer Prizes. And again, we see that here today, how different the world would be without the knowledge that is created by that journalism. However frustrating it is sometimes, yes, things take a long time, it doesn't go perfectly at all. We see it again. But imagine how much worse it would be without the kind of work that we honored last night and we see here again today. So, so as they pointed out, you know, I am the chairman of the Tampa Bay Times, and I am the chairman of the Poynter Institute, and I was the chairman of the Pulitzer Prizes for a while. And as chairman, typically you get the last word, but not today. Today, I happily yield the last word at this luncheon to Last Word of Song. And so please help me welcome back for our closing this today, our musical benediction, if you will, the power of song for a final number here.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Sing freedom, freedom. Yeah, freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom. Yes, freedom's coming and it won't be long. Oh, I took a little trip upon a Greyhound bus. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. To end segregation, cause of this we must. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom. Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom. Freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Well, I ain't been to heaven, but I know I'm right.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Up in heaven, there's no black or white.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Freedom,
Freedom, freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Well, I ain't been to heaven, but I've been told.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Well, up in heaven, there is no Jim Crow.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom, freedom's coming and it won't be long. Freedom, freedom, freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Well, too many people are crying and dying.
Freedom's coming and it won't be long.
Wanna help them get their healing on this here side.
Freedom's coming
Help us
and it won't
say
be
freedom.
long. Freedom, freedom,
Freedom.
freedom's coming and it won't
Sing
be
freedom.
long. Freedom,
Oh.
freedom,
Freedom.
freedom's coming
Help us
and it
sing,
won't
say
be
freedom.
long. Freedom, freedom, freedom's coming and it
One
won't
more
be
time,
long.
say
Freedom, freedom, freedom's coming and it won't be long. 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 St. Pete strong and it won't be long. St. Pete strong and it won't be long.
St. Pete strong.
St. Pete strong and it won't be
Say
long.
Ferguson strong.
Ferguson strong and it won't be long.
Ferguson strong.
Ferguson strong and it won't be
Chicago
long.
strong.
Chicago strong and it won't be
Chicago.
long. Chicago strong and it won't
Baltimore
be
strong,
long.
yeah.
Baltimore strong and it
Baltimore
won't be
strong,
long.
yeah.
Baltimore strong and it
Tampa
won't
Bay
be
strong,
long.
yeah.
Tampa Bay strong and it
Tampa
won't
Bay
be
strong,
long.
yeah.
Tampa Bay strong and it won't
Freedom
be
strong.
long. Freedom strong and it won't